All right, moving on, we're going to talk a little bit more about carbohydrates, very important molecules for all living things, including humans. As you guys know carbohydrates are important. And all right, so what are some basic features of carbohydrates? So when we're talking about carbohydrates, most of these are sugars, starches. Those are more common names for carbohydrates. Sugars are monomers, building blocks. Starches are polymers. Starches are really built from sugars that get linked together, they get bonded together through dehydration synthesis in chains. All right, so generally carbohydrates are built from carbon atoms, hydrogen, and oxygen that are linked together, bonded together to make these molecules. And in general, they follow this pattern. So what that means, they're CH2O with an N. That means for every carbon in one of these molecules, you typically have two hydrogens and you typically have one oxygen. So you'll have different numbers of those. It depends on how many of those you have. Like some sugars have 5 carbons, some have 6, and so forth and so on. Some have fewer. But generally, carbohydrates exist in that type of pattern. You have that type of ratio between those particular atoms. And that's actually where the name carbohydrate comes from. Carbo refers to carbon. The hydra there is like hydro, that's referring to water. So what does that pattern look like? There's a carbon, there's H2O for water. So that's where the name actually came from. Now that's not the law. There are carbohydrates that have nitrogen atoms in them. There's a lot of diversity with carbohydrates, but in general they follow that pattern. All right, there are 3 classes of carbohydrates. Monosaccharides, mono means one, and saccharide is another term for sugar. So that literally means single sugar, kind of like it sounds. All right, and then a disaccharide is where you have, there's a sugar and there's a sugar bonded together. So if you got 2 saccharides, 2 sugars linked together, that's going to be a disaccharide. That's pretty easy. Poly means many. That prefix means many. So if you have a starch where you might have thousands of sugars bonded together, that's going to be a type of polysaccharide. All right, so you do want to learn that terminology because those types of things come up pretty frequently. Do know for each of these different kinds of organic compounds that we're talking about, what are the monomers? What are the building blocks? So your building blocks of carbohydrates are monosaccharides or sugars. Know both of those because that comes up quite a bit as you move through your biology courses. All right, what are the main functions of carbohydrates? Okay, so cells love to use carbohydrates for energy. You guys know that. And glucose especially. Glucose is a type of monosaccharide or sugar. And that is the preferred quick energy source for cells. All cells need energy. They need an energy source because it takes energy to power all those endergonic things they have to do, all that building they have to do, and other things like movement takes energy, takes work to make that happen. And the source of that energy are the nutrient type molecules we take in from our diet. Organic compounds, those are our nutrients that we take in. That's where we get our energy from. Glucose happens to be the preferred energy source for cells like ours. All right, and you'll hear lots about glucose as you move through your biology classes. Some carbohydrates play structural roles, so they can be parts of other molecules, and a good example of that is ribose. Ribose is another type of sugar that's different from glucose, and it's actually one of the building blocks of another kind of organic molecule called RNA. RNA is a type of nucleic acid. And nucleic acids are one of those 4 types of organic molecules that we're learning about here. All right, so here are some example monosaccharides. They're actually showing you some chemical structures there. And no, you don't have to know how to draw these. You don't have to memorize the chemical structures. It's just showing you some of the diversity that you have here. Some sugars are called hexoses, and like hexagon, that's a six-sided figure. And hexose means they have 6 carbons. So like glucose is a hexose, because you can't see it, but there's a carbon there, right there, right there. That's number 3, 4, 5, and then there's another one up here. So organic chemical structures, if you ever take an organic chemistry class, they don't always draw in the carbons in the diagrams just to make it a little bit simpler. Fructose, the fruit sugar, is another type of 6-carbon sugar, and but the positions of the carbons, you can see that the molecule looks different, so that's what makes it fructose rather than glucose. That pattern of arrangement of those atoms is very important. Here's another type of sugar called galactose. And galactose looks very similar to glucose. The differences are very subtle, but nevertheless, some of the arrangements of the oxygens versus the hydrogens are really all that differs between galactose and glucose. But nevertheless, even those little subtle differences makes this an entirely different type of sugar from this one. Then some sugars are called pentoses, like a pentagram would have 5, or a pentagon would have 5 sides. This means 5 carbons. These are 5-carbon sugars. So deoxyribose is one, ribose is another, and so you have a carbon there, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's a 5-carbon sugar. All right, then a disaccharide means 2 monosaccharides have been covalently bonded together, and there are many different examples of those. We already took a look at sucrose on the last video lecture. Sucrose is a disaccharide, and it consists of a glucose bonded to fructose. Maltose is a disaccharide where you have 2 glucose molecules bonded together. That's pretty common. You'll even see that as an ingredient added to foods. And lactose, which where have you heard of that before? Lactose is present in a lot of dairy products, and that consists of a galactose sugar bonded to a glucose sugar. All right, so and again, which of these sugars you have in these disaccharides makes them completely different molecules with different functions and properties. Nobody really has trouble digesting sucrose, but you guys know some people are lactose intolerant. They can't digest this, and which means they can't split galactose and glucose apart from each other. And so because of that, they cannot absorb these sugars. They can't use these for nutrition, and it also can cause intestinal irritation. All right, then polysaccharides, as we mentioned before, these are where you have chains of sugars or monosaccharides linked together. And we've already talked about how glycogen is a large molecule that consists of a lot of glucoses that are bonded together. And they're in chains, but those chains even branch. That's what they're showing you here. So they can be bonded together in different ways. And glycogen is a storage molecule. So you get your cells in your liver and your skeletal muscles, your muscle cells, produce glycogen. So like if you have excess glucose sugars because you've just eaten a meal that's high in calories, high in sugar, high in carbohydrates, you'll have lots of these glucose sugars around, and so your liver and your muscle cells don't want to waste that sugar, so they'll actually take those excess glucoses and bond them together to make glycogen. All right, they do that through dehydration synthesis. When you need to use that glucose for energy, those cells will take the glycogens and split the bonds, break the bonds. They'll do hydrolysis reactions to clip out all those glucoses, and then those glucoses can be used for energy needs. All right, that's a little quick overview of carbohydrates. You do want to learn the basic functions of these different types of organic molecules and the terminology, and know the building blocks of the larger types of organic molecules. Be sure you're keeping track of that info as we go through this content. You'll have lots of practice with this terminology on Mastering A&P and then also in the review activity I have posted on Blackboard for you. All right, so the next one we're going to move on over to lipids, which you know better as fats.